All right, guys, so today we're going to be talking about chapter 3, and it's just called China and Antiquity. Um, I'm going to do my best with some of the pronunciation of these names. I've been teaching this stuff for quite some time, and I still struggle with a few, so just bear with me. But this is just kind of a breakdown of what you'll see throughout the book. It's divided into 6 different sections. So I wanted to start with just showing you a map of what we'll be talking about. In particular, these 2 major rivers, the Huanghe and the Yangtze. And it's these 2 major river valleys where we're going to see the earliest civilizations in China. But I also wanted to point out on the map, you can see a number of major geographic features. The largest and tallest mountain range in the world borders China to the left, so the Himalaya Mountains. To the north, you have the Gobi Desert, one of the largest deserts in the world, and then otherwise bordered by the ocean. And so while you have some places that you may find familiar here, of course, here's Japan, here's Korea, and then here you have the Indo-Chinese peninsula where Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia are, and then Indonesia here to the south. But for much of the world, China is geographically isolated. And so these 2 river valleys are going to develop distinct cultures unique from any that we've studied so far. So they're a fascinating group, and let's go ahead and get started. So I wanted to use a slightly different format. Hopefully you find it helpful. If not, just as we begin, kind of a question to ask yourselves about this first section, and again, it's broken up into 6 different sections, is just, speaking of geography, now that we've looked at the map, how does this influence these civilizations that arose? And to what degree does geography influence different characteristics, particularly those that distinguish China from other civilizations? So we'll start at the earliest written records of Chinese civilization. So prior to writing, any records we have that predate written history in China come from oral traditions. That means they were passed down generationally. And these oral traditions tell the story of how China was formed. Now, while historians don't accept these legends as literal, they're helpful as part of the process in which people of the ancient world tried to make sense of the world and their place in it. While the earliest 3 sovereigns of Chinese history might not actually have existed, their stories reflect some of the defining characteristics of Chinese civilization. The interaction between nomadic and agricultural people. The importance of the family as a basic unit of Chinese life. And the development of a unique system of writing. Now there are 2 Neolithic, this means New Stone Age, societies that grew out of the Yellow River Valley. The Yang Shao and the Long Shang cultures can be identified by their pottery. The civilization slowly spread from smaller settlements to larger urban areas. Eventually, these simple Neolithic communities mastered agriculture and grew into more sophisticated and complex societies. Now, while the valleys eventually became among the greatest food-producing areas of the ancient world, in fact, only about 12% of the land is even suitable for farming. Most of the rest of China is made up of mountains and deserts that encircle the country on its northern and western frontiers. This served to isolate ancient China from the rest of the ancient world, including more advanced societies in other parts of Asia. To the north of the Gobi Desert, Central Asia, and the Tibetan Plateau. These plateaus were sparsely inhabited by peoples of the Mongolian, Indo-European, or Turkish groups. Most of them were primarily pastoral, and interactions with the Chinese were frequently unstable. These frontier peoples developed impressive military skills and became increasingly aggressive, conquering for wealth and additional lands. The northern frontier became a borderline of conflict between small Chinese farmers and the invading peoples. When China was unified and blessed with capable rulers, it could usually keep the nomadic intruders at bay. When China was internally weak, though, it was vulnerable to outside attack, and often nomadic people succeeded in overthrowing Chinese rulers. On the other side, though, China normally had little to fear. To the east was the China Sea. While it was a haven for pirates and a source of typhoons, it was rarely a significant cause for concern. To the south of the Yangtze River was a hilly region that was inhabited by a mixture of people with varied languages and ethnic backgrounds who focused primarily on farming, fishing, and gathering food. These people were eventually absorbed into the expansion of Chinese civilization. So next I just wanted to show you a few things that I thought were really cool. This is from the shoulder blade of an ox. And the inscriptions on these oracle bones suggest that the elite believed they could communicate with the supernatural world. The oracle bones also show that the king was viewed as an intermediary between heaven and earth. The Chinese practice of vulneration of ancestors developed from these beliefs. Historians traditionally view the beginning of Chinese civilization with the founding of the Qin Dynasty, roughly 4,000 years ago. The exact date of the founding of the Qin Dynasty is disputed. However, archaeological artifacts from various sites across north-central China provide evidence for its existence. Eventually, the Qin Dynasty was replaced by the Zhou Dynasty. The original capital of the Zhou Dynasty has been excavated by archaeologists, and found within are examples of China's first writing on oracle bones. These fragments of ox and chicken bones and often turtle shells contain the inscriptions of people practicing divination. Everything we know about this early civilization is from these oracle bones. China under the Shang was a predominantly agricultural society ruled by an upper class that functioned as a warrior class. This class kept control over precious resources such as metals and salt. Combat was carried out on chariots and by foot soldiers. The Shang king ruled a kingdom of divided territories, each being governed by a chieftain appointed by the Shang king. The importance of the ruler is proven in the ritual sacrifices that occurred upon the death of the king. Hundreds of his retainers were buried with him in the royal tomb. The inscriptions on the oracle bones suggest that the elite believed they could communicate with the supernatural world. The oracle bones also show that the king was viewed as an intermediary between heaven and earth. The Chinese practice of vulneration of ancestors developed from these beliefs. Early in Chinese civilization, society was organized by clans rather than family units. But in some cases, entire villages would use the same clan name. The concept of shared destiny and working toward a common goal took precedence over the concept of the individual. Now, by the time of the Shang Dynasty, the classes were becoming more separate. It's likely that the poor were obligated to work the farms of the chieftain and other elites in the village rather than own and work their own land. The aristocratic elite mostly served to make war and to work as bureaucrats. The villages also likely included a small number of merchants, artisans, and slaves. The Shang are best known for their mastery of bronze casting. Utensils, weapons, and other bronze objects have been found in royal tombs throughout the areas under the Shang influence. They also created a sophisticated writing system that would eventually spread and evolve into today's modern Chinese language. So known to history as Qin Shi Huangdi, he was a man of forceful personality and immense ambition who had ascended to the throne of the Qin Dynasty in 246 BCE at the age of 13. These ceremonial weapons were found in a tomb dating back to the Zhou Dynasty and are among the earliest examples of metalwork in ancient China. So when we talk about Neolithic China, what that really means is translated New Stone Age, but it's really just after the discovery of farming. And so in this part of the world, when we look at Neolithic China, we're looking at where farming villages are emerging. And the two key river systems to know are the Huanghe and the Yangtze. To zoom in a little bit, here is the center of Zhou China, or the Zhou Dynasty. Now in the 11th century BCE, the Zhou Dynasty was overthrown by a new warring state. The Zhou Dynasty would last more than 800 years and would be the longest thriving dynasty in Chinese history. The Zhou maintained that they ruled China because of a mandate of heaven. Their kings ruled by divine right. For the most part, the Zhou Dynasty had the same political structure of its predecessors, with some changes. At its base structure, the Zhou Dynasty was ruled by a king who served as the head of the bureaucracy that included ministries responsible for education rights, law, and public works. However, some innovations were introduced. One of the oldest surviving documents on statecraft comes from the Zhou Dynasty. Known as the Rights of Zao, it declared that the dynasty was able to rule China because it possessed the mandate of heaven. According to this concept, heaven, by which point was not viewed as a deity, maintained order in the universe through the Zhao king, who ruled as a representative of heaven, but not a divine being. The king was selected to rule because of his talent and virtue, and he was responsible for governing his people with compassion and efficiency. It was his job to appease the gods in order to protect the people from natural calamities or bad harvests. Now, if the king failed to rule well, he could be overthrown and replaced by a new ruler, in theory. This idea is what justified the Zhao conquest of the Shang. Eventually, the concept of the heavenly mandate would become a staple of Chinese statecraft. The Zhou Dynasty is where the essential characteristics of Chinese civilization likely formed, although they did keep some of the Shang institutions, including a pattern of servitude, in which peasants worked the lands owned by their lord, as well as plots for themselves. Agriculturally, the Zhou developed large-scale water control projects, including canals and spillways, and the concept of fertilizer. Mass cultivation of wet rice enabled the population to increase to an estimated 20 million. Other industries such as ironwork, jade, tooling, and silk manufacturing created a trade in high-priced luxury goods. Most often, trade and manufacturing were carried out by the local merchants and artisans, but these people were controlled by the local lords and were considered the property of those lords, to the point that they could be bought and sold. There was a slave class as well, but these were generally prisoners of war, captured during conflicts in neighboring territories. Now, Confucius was born in the state of Lu in 551 BCE. He worked toward becoming a political advisor, but with little success. His main ideas were contained in the Analects, which describes a very skeptical view of heaven. including his belief that speculating about the metaphysical was useless. Instead, his interest focused on political and ethical concepts. Confucius believed that if human beings could act harmoniously with the purposes of the universe, their lives would be better. Most of his concerns revolved around human behavior. The key to proper behavior was to behave in accordance with the Tao, or the way. He assumed that all human beings had their own Tao, based on their role in life, and it was their duty to follow it. Two concepts that emerged from the Tao were duty, that is a responsibility of all individuals to their family and community, and humanity, or human-heartedness, a sense of compassion and empathy for others. His political ideals included a government open to all men of superior quality, regardless of birth. The concept included the ideal of rule by merit. Now, legalism was a school of thought that argued that human beings were by nature evil. Therefore, humans would follow the correct path only if forced to do so through harsh laws with stiff penalties. Legalists disagreed with the Confucian belief that the universe has a moral code. Only firm action by the state could bring about social order. Fear was a better motivator than reward. Now, Taoism, often spelled Taoism, was a popular alternative to Confucianism. According to tradition, the school of thought was founded by a contemporary of Confucius called Lao Tzu, or the Old Master. Taoism, much like other philosophies, set out to create forms of proper behavior. However, where Confucian doctrine asserts that it is the duty of every human to work toward improvement, Taoism encourages its followers to practice inaction. They contended that the true way to interpret the will of heaven is not action, but inaction. Taoism also played a role as a loose framework for the popular spiritual beliefs among ordinary Chinese. Popular Taoism was less a philosophy than a religion, and as such it included a number of rituals and forms of behavior that were regarded as a means of achieving heavenly salvation. For most Chinese people, the concept of heaven was not vague. Rather, it was a place where numerous gods and spirits lived. The other important aspect of popular religion during this time was the belief in Ancestor Vulneration, in which the Chinese people believed that the spirits of deceased family members lived in the atmosphere for a period of time. During this period, living family members needed to care for the spirits, or they would be stuck, and they would haunt the family forever. So I couldn't help myself. I had to have at least one silly illustration of legalism, but it's this idea that you have to idiot-proof everything, or we will just fail. And it was this philosophy, legalism, that Shi Huangdi used to justify such a harsh rule that we'll see in just a moment. You know, for example, I know the quality of the painting's not very good, but this is an illustration of people burning books teaching of Confucianism because they disagreed with Shi Huangdi's philosophy. And so legalism, you can see it in different societies around the world. It's often this philosophy is present in highly authoritarian societies. So little is known about the life of Lao Tzu, shown on the left, and it's unlikely that he and Confucius ever met. According to tradition, though, the two held a face-to-face meeting. This alleged discussion must have been interesting, because the views about their nature of reality were quite the opposite. Now, as the Zhou Dynasty began to decline, so did the authority and influence of the monarchy. New iron weapons for foot soldiers and armed cavalry made their first appearance in China. Stable cities now found themselves threatened by stronger and well-equipped armies. The young state of Qin emerged as a key player in Chinese conflicts by adopting many agricultural, governmental, military, and fiscal reforms. Slowly, the Qin ruler subsided his rivals and solidified control. By 221 BCE, Shi Huangdi would become the first emperor of the Qin. The Qin Dynasty completely transformed Chinese politics. Philosophical philosophies were prohibited, and legalism became the official ideology. Anyone who opposed the regime were punished, including execution, and book burning was quite common. Legalistic theory also gave birth to many administrative and political practices, some of which would survive beyond the Qin Dynasty. The Qin was a highly centralized state with three ministries: a civil authority, a military authority, and a censorate consisting of inspectors. This system became the basis for standard administrative procedure in future dynasties. Government officials were promoted based on merit by the court and were subject to dismissal at the emperor's whim. Now, a fan of centralization, Qin Shi Huangdi established a unified system of weights and measures, standardized the monetary system and the written forms of Chinese characters, and ordered that the construction of roads throughout the empire be identical. He also eliminated the remaining powers of the elite class and divided their estates among the peasants, who were now taxed by the state. This served to eliminate potential rivals and also to increase revenue for the state. The system was not, however, advantageous to peasants or the merchants. For the peasants, a more hands-on government meant that they could be taxed more efficiently and be drafted for military service in various public works projects. Now, for the merchants, it meant that private commercial activities were heavily restricted and just as heavily taxed. Additionally, many forms of commerce and manufacturing, such as mining or winemaking, or even salt distribution, became government monopolies. Qin Shi Huangdi was also very hands-on with regard to foreign affairs. A main cause for concern were the nomadic people in the north called the Shi Nu, who became more nomadic and began moving southward in response to climate change. Now, as the climate became drier, the Zhai Nu were forced to rely on animal husbandry and became masters at horseback riding. Loose communities organized themselves so that the people could move throughout the area, searching for pasture lands for their herds. As usable lands diminished, rival communities began fighting. Qin Shi Huangdi's answer was to begin construction of the Great Wall. The wall is 4,000 miles long. It is constructed of massive granite blocks. Its top is wide enough to serve as a roadway for horse-drawn chariots. It was built in segments over an extended period of time. The wall most often seen in images was constructed over 1,500 years after the Qin rule. The purpose of the legalistic system was to make the Qin dynasty more efficient and totally secure. However, neither of these things actually ever occurred. Although he tried to form an empire that would be ruled by his sons for thousands of years, instead, Qin Shi Huangdi simply alienated many key groups. And as such, upon his death in 210 BCE, the Qin dynasty developed into factions and 4 years later was overthrown. So, just a brief rundown of the different ruling families and just a chronology of the history, but you can find this in your textbooks. So, I wanted to show how the decline of the Qin dynasty looked on a map. You know, when I said it broke up into rival factions and then was overthrown. So, you know, what was once a highly centralized government under direct control splintered. And so here's the Qin dynasty, which reigned from 221 to 206 BCE. In the northern part of the map, you can see the earliest parts of the Great Wall of China, and you can see their influence. Now, once the Qin dynasty fell, there was a brief period of civil war as several possible successors competed to lead China. Now, out of this competition came the Han Dynasty, one of the greatest and most durable dynasties in Chinese history. It would later be so closely identified with the advance of Chinese civilization that even today, the Chinese sometimes refer to themselves as the people of Han. The Han Dynasty began with the integration of Confucian doctrine with legalistic institutions, creating a system generally known as state Confucianism. At first, Emperor Han Gazu deviated from the Qin philosophy of centralized rule. However, consistent unrest in the countryside forced a change in that policy. To bring centralized rule back, the Han rulers borrowed the three-part division of the central government. It also retained the system of local government. Additionally, the Han reapplied the Qin system of selecting government officials based on merit rather than birth. Local officials were able to recommend candidates for public service. And by 165 BCE, the first public service examination was administered to candidates for positions in the bureaucracy. And shortly thereafter, an academy was established to train candidates. While the first candidates were all from wealthy families, the principle of selecting officials on merit was established and would eventually become standard practice. Now, Han rulers contributed to their problems by adopting financial policies that led to greater amounts of land in the hands of the wealthy. The free peasantry paid taxes directly to the state to limit the wealth of noble families. But there were still difficulties in avoiding economic inequity. The Han Dynasty also began to move cautiously into foreign trade, mostly with neighboring areas in Central and Southeast Asia. Although trade relations were established with countries as far away as India and the Mediterranean, where active contacts were maintained within the Roman Empire. The Han emperors continued the process of expansion and consolidation of territory, expanding as far west as the Caspian Sea and Central Asia. Silk, a filament recovered from the cocoons of silkworms, had been produced in China since the 4th millennia BCE. Eventually, knowledge of the wonder product reached the outside world, and Chinese silk exports began to rise dramatically. By the end of the 1st century BCE, the Han Empire had been falling apart for decades. There were efforts to revive the Han Dynasty, and for a period of time, the leaders were strong enough to revive some of the glory of the early Han. However, conflicts with the Zhou tribes in the north continued, and trade disputes were also common. The Han leaders returned to a policy of military force, recruiting professional armies from among the minority people. But as those armies were unreliable in both loyalty and performance, raids on Chinese territories continued up to the end of the Han Dynasty. The population, which had been estimated at about 60 million in China's first census in the year 2 of the Common Era, had shrunk less to 1/3 of that number 200 years later. In the early 3rd century of the Common Era, the dynasty was finally brought to an end when power was seized by Zhou Dynasty, a general known to later generations as one of the main characters in the famous Chinese epic, The Romance of the Three Kingdoms. So just a couple illustrations. This is the making of paper. One of China's most important contributions to the world was the invention of paper during the Han Dynasty. Although the first known use of paper for writing dates back to the 1st century BCE, paper was used for clothing, for wrapping materials, military armor, and of course toilet paper. So this is a clay sculpture of a horse and a rider, and it's just a great example of artistry during the Han Dynasty. So the Han Empire at its height. To the north, you can see the areas outlined in green are where the nomadic peoples are, the Zhou. And then you can see the beginnings of the Great Wall. This is what was standing during the Han period. And you can see that the location is specific to stop the Zhou, or what would later be called the Mongols. And using these geographic features of the Himalayas all the way to the sea, with the division of these various nomadic groups until Genghis Khan united all the tribes, was quite effective. Now, the family served as the basic social and economic unit in China. It took on a sacred role, and an increasingly important one, with the need for cooperation in cultivating rice. Rice became the primary crop because it was highly productive with high nutritional value, but it was also very labor intensive. And this helped to solidify the importance of the community and the family. The concept of family included 5 cardinal hierarchical relationships. Ruler to subject. All were subject to the king. Father to son. The son was subordinate to the father. Husband and wife. The wife was subordinate to her husband. Older brother to younger brother. The younger brother was subordinate to the older brother. And friend to friend. A friend had a proper and reciprocal relationship to another. Stable family systems based on obedience and hard work meant that there could be an efficient government. However, putting family loyalty over loyalty to the state could cause a threat to a centralized monarchy. For that reason, the Qin attempted to destroy the clan system in China and assert the primacy of the state, with legalists attempting to impose heavy taxes on any family with more than 2 adult sons. But the Qin attempts ran against tradition, as well as the dynamics of the Chinese economy. So under the Han, the family system revived and increased in importance. More is known about the elite than the common person in ancient China. Homes were made of wooden planks and later tile. They had wings surrounding a central courtyard. The home provided space for several generations to live under one roof. Furniture was sparse and clothing simple. Staple foods included millet, wheat, barley, soybeans, mustard greens, and bamboo shoots. Cities began to take on the central importance that they would hold throughout later Chinese history. Urban centers were divided into neighborhoods, perhaps a forerunner of the grid pattern assumed by imperial cities under later dynasties, as a means of facilitating control under the population. Under the Qin and the Han, cities became the cultural hub of Chinese society as never before, although the residents made up only a tiny proportion of the total population. Male dominance was a key element in the social system of ancient China. As in many traditional societies, the male was considered of transcendent importance because of his role as a food procurer, or in the cases of farming communities, food producer. During ancient times, women apparently did not normally occupy formal positions of authority, but they often became a force in politics, especially at court, where wives of the ruler or other female members of the royal family were often influential in palace intrigue. Confucius thought that the accepted dual roles of men and women in Chinese society, but they also did not denigrate the importance of women as mothers and homemakers. However, there was no denying that women were subordinate to men in Chinese society. Women could not own property, and there was no dowry system set up in ancient China to provide financial security for a wife. Sadly, relatively little remains of the cultural achievements of prehistoric China, as those artifacts have been adversely affected by the humid climate of the Chinese valleys. Some grave sites from the early 2nd millennia BCE have been unearthed, and more recently, ancient texts recorded on bamboo slips and discovered in burial tombs have been given to historians as an idea of the nature of the political and philosophical debates during the latter parts of the 4th century BCE. Now, ancient China was rich with cultural achievements. Bronze casting became a large-scale business, with more than 10,000 vessels surviving through today. These were cast using wax models, a long-lost technique. Bronze work declined as ironworking became more popular and cheaper. The tomb of Qin Shi Huangdi illustrated the capabilities of artisans, as well as their ability to carry out large-scale projects. The tomb includes a life-size terracotta army of more than 5,000 men, including models of their horses, wooden chariots, and 7,000 bronze weapons. The art of bronze casting deteriorated for two reasons. The first was the rise in popularity of ironworking, and the second was the development of cheaper materials such as ceramics and lacquerware. One amazing archaeological find was that of a large terracotta army in the tomb of this Emperor Shi Huangdi, and it appeared to be a recreation of his imperial guard and was meant to accompany the emperor on his journey to the next world. And the most amazing features of this army, of more than 6,000 figures just in the pit, and every one were individually unique. Now, as demonstrated by the oracle bones, the Chinese developed a simple, functional script as early as the Zhou Dynasty. Like other ancient languages, it was primarily ideographic and pictographic in form. The language maintained its ideographic quality in part because of its aesthetic value. The written language would come to be seen as an art form, as well as a means of communication. The written language was standardized under the Qin, so that educated Chinese across the country could understand it. It became the language of the bureaucracy and the vehicle for the transmission of Chinese culture. So this is a wine vessel dating back to the Zhou Dynasty, used initially as food containers in royal ceremonial rites during the Qin Dynasty. Chinese bronze makers were the production of an advanced technology unmatched in contemporary civilization. This wine vessel displays a deep green patina, as well as a monster motif, complete with large globe eyes, nostrils, and fangs, typical of many Shang bronzes. So as I was mentioning earlier, this is the great tomb of the Emperor Shi Huangdi. This is his terracotta army, more than 6,000 figures, each individually carved. It's incredible. Here's an example of ancient Chinese writing. Some of the oldest written records date back thousands of years. So, just by way of summary, we've covered the Zhou Dynasty, the era of the warring states, the time of the first unified empire under the Han Dynasty. We've talked about some of the Chinese philosophers like Confucius, Taoism, and even legalism. So we've covered a vast timeline. There's a copy of this in your book as well. So like many of the chapters, we'll hop around different parts of the world and then discuss a wide timeline. And then we'll revisit many of these places in a more recent time frame as we go through later in this course. That's it for now.